Next Up. I'm Wendy Wiese with my colleague Ray Hartmann, and we have a terrific conversation for you tonight. Joining us is Jeffrey Nussbaum. He has been a professional speechwriter for more than 2 decades, beginning his career writing speeches for Vice President Al Gore, and most recently, he was senior speechwriter for President Joe Biden at the White House. He now has a brand new book. It's called Undelivered: The Never Heard Speeches That Would Have Rewritten History. Jeff, welcome to St. Louis.
Good to be here.
Welcome to Next Up. We're so happy to have you. First of all, let's talk a little bit about your career. Sure. And how you got to the White House.
Yeah, so I applied after my second year in college for the White House internship. And knowing that my grades wouldn't put me over the top, I wrote a relatively cheeky application essay about the fact that my middle sister, when she was 1 and I was 5, we went into the Oval Office and she wet the rug in the Oval Office. And so my essay was, very few people get a chance to make a mark in the White House. I just want a chance to improve the one my sister already made.
Fantastic.
They thought, let's put the guy in speechwriting, and that's where I ended up.
Well, when you talk about this book, you said that it was an obsession. Can you explain how these unfinished or undelivered speeches became such an obsession with you?
Yeah, so this began for me election night 2000. I was the kid speechwriter for Al Gore, and that night he had 3 speeches prepared: a victory, a concession, and then, strangely enough, they thought he might win the Electoral College but lose the popular vote. As it went, the opposite happened, and no speeches were given that night. And I lost them. So the irony of this book about undelivered speeches is the ones I don't have were the ones that set the whole thing in motion. But it got me thinking, where are these other places in history, not just in political history, where an outcome was so much in doubt that a speech accounting for an alternate outcome was also prepared? And I started to see them in lots of different places where I looked.
Before we go, if I want to, you are not, I was hoping we could say you're from St. Louis, but you got a St. Louis connection.
I do. My folks moved here when I was in college, right when my younger sister was starting college, and then I have a baby sister who grew up here. And so St. Louis is as much home as anywhere we've ever known, and we've loved living here and being here.
So we will claim you when this hits the top of the
if all
New York
goes
Times
well,
bestsellers list.
I'm happy to be claimed if all goes well. You're welcome to disown me if it doesn't.
We'll have 2 speeches, right?
Exactly right.
Okay.
Is there a favorite in here for you?
So the favorite is the one that's the most obscure, and it's Governor Altgeld in Illinois at the turn of like right before 1900, was drummed out of office for pardoning the Haymarket prisoners. And he had a beautiful farewell address prepared that he was denied the opportunity to read. And when you read it today, it's like a shot across the bow for how we should be behaving today, but aren't. It's about parties need to put partisanship aside and govern. It's about elected officials, that there's no greater sin than to be an elected official and not stand up and do something for humanity. So it just resonates so powerfully today, and that's one of my favorite chapters.
How much pressure is on the speechwriter? It seems that when we had 3 networks, maybe a couple of radio networks, maybe the pressure wasn't as intense in terms of all of the different real-time news options that we have today. How has that pressure changed?
I love that question, because there was a time when your audience was delivered to you and your audience was everyone.
Right.
And now, comedians talk about having to compete with every joke on Twitter. I think speechwriters and politicians and elected officials and business leaders have to compete with a million different distractions. And so the writing now, yes, you want to write a full argument, a full persuasive speech, but you also always have in the back of your mind, what's that moment that's going to break through, that's going to become viral? And that's something that has affected or infected the profession, depending on how you look at it.
You know, Jeff, I've had my own opportunity to test speech writing, and one of the, my speeches resulted in a certain governor no longer being governor, and they were burned, actually, so they were not actually lost. But one of the things I always found interesting is, while you're writing and you're composing, you're speaking in someone else's voice. Was that different for you with, say, an Al Gore or Well, the current president.
Yeah, well, first of all, you beat me to it. I was going to hold you up as a paragon of speechwriting and a model for the career
It's
of all
called helping
speechwriters.
someone put their foot in their mouth.
Well,
No,
I used to joke that you could measure my influence by, not by how much progress I could make, but how much damage I could do, you know? So I get the impulse to limit the damage you do. But to answer the question, yes, you are a little bit of a character actor. You hear the speaker's voice in your head as you write. And I often say that it's easy to sound like someone. There's enough YouTube videos and interviews that you can read to kind of mimic someone. But it doesn't really work for them until it thinks like them. Right. So I spend a lot of time with the people I work with trying to figure out, how do they make an argument? How do they see the world? Because if it thinks like them, it's more likely to sound like them.
One of the things that surprised me the most was how many hands touch these speeches. Could you share with our viewers the Cuban Missile Crisis and how many different people were in the room, how many people have to sign off? And these are, as you said, these are pressurized circumstances with a time crunch like no other.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite chapters. So this is John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The military advisors want him to announce airstrikes on Cuba as soon as we see the missile sites. They want 800 airstrikes right away. Kennedy makes a play for time and basically has his advisors split into two groups, those in favor of airstrikes and those in favor of a blockade. And this is the first use of the term hawks and doves in history.
Wow.
So, and he wants, at RFK's urging, at his brother's urging, that whichever course of action we choose, each group is going to present the preferred course of action, but they need to preface it with a speech. Because if we can't explain it to the American people, maybe this isn't the right course of action. And so there are dozens of people, State Department officials, National Security Council officials, legal advisors, all looking at this to basically say, is this the acceptable argument? Is this the course we want to choose? And in that speech, one of my favorite harrowing moments is there's a parenthetical in the speech that says, holds for first reports of action. In other words, for journalists, it's like a TK. They're going to fill in what happened. But only in retrospect do we realize that the first reports of action could have been a devastating nuclear counterstrike because those missiles were already active. We just didn't know it.
Wow. Hillary Clinton made the book.
She did. She did.
Talk about that. And I, of course, naturally looked for a Trump, but he wasn't in the book. So I want to know, first of all, about Hillary and maybe there's going to be a sequel that will
That's right. That's right. My hope is that the publication of this book will bring some speeches I didn't know about out of the woodwork. And in fact, it already has. A couple of people have emailed me about interesting stuff. But to your question about the Hillary speech, it is really interesting. So she gave me her victory speech, her 2016 victory speech. And in that speech, you see all of the fissures that ran through her campaign run right into the victory. What are we going to say to the Bernie supporters? What are we going to say to the Trump voters who I called deplorable? What are we going to say to the elite media that expected a bigger win? And initially, the speech was kind of missing that moment that she was looking for. And then she got an email, unsolicited, from a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, and it kind of squared with where she wanted to go, which was telling her mother's story. Her mother had a very difficult life and difficult childhood, telling that story in a new way. And so to conclude the speech, she has this beautiful imagined conversation where an adult Hillary sees her mother as an 8-year-old who's being sent cross-country on a train with her younger sister to basically live in servitude. And she sits down next to her mother as an 8-year-old and says, you're going to have a tough life, but you're going to have a daughter, and that daughter is going to be president of the United States. And it would have just been a beautiful, powerful moment.
Wow.
As someone who is fresh out of the White House and those ranks, how aware are you while you're writing a speech for the President of the United States, the most powerful person on earth, in terms of political discourse and the tone of political discourse today? How important was that to your former boss and to you as an individual speechwriter?
Yeah, there is still a formality to the presidency that is different. It's just different. There's certain things the president can't say. There's certain things the president can't wear. There's certain things the president can't do. And so I write a lot of jokes. I love humor. It's one of my sidelines. But for the president, there are very few jokes that actually work because, for two reasons, right? Humor should be about punching up, and when you're the president, you're the top, so there's nowhere up to punch. And the other thing is that you don't want to diminish the office. I mean, Presidents Reagan and others basically said that I couldn't take off my suit coat in the Oval Office. And this president doesn't do that either. And so you do want to recognize that two things. One is that the presidency is different, and the presidency should have dignity to it that's different than other offices. The other thing you recognize is that it's not just America, but the world that parses these words. So the number of debates and conversations we have about a phrase, about can we say, this country has been our friend forever, which is the type of thing anyone would just toss off as a platitude, but the National Security Council will sometimes say, no, that's not, we can't say that. That sends a message that we don't want to send.
So it is a line by line parsing. Is that correct?
Absolutely, absolutely.
With a room full, a theater full of observers.
Yeah, well, in this case, it's primarily initially an email distribution.
Sure.
Where every office gets a chance to look. Domestic policy, foreign policy, research, lawyers, and they all get a chance to look and they all flag their concerns. But ultimately, they are still advisors. They're still making recommendations. And what gets said or what doesn't get said comes down to what the president wants to say or thinks we should say. And so he has, he may not have override authority over the Senate, but he certainly has override authority over every aspect of what goes on in the White House.
I'm just struck by, with Joe Biden, it would seem like worrying about diminishing the office after the last guy just doesn't seem like it'd be high on your list, but I guess you'd think in big picture. I started to ask you about Trump, and I can't let go of it. Do you, first of all, in your line of work, do you know some Trump speechwriters?
I do.
I'm guessing that.
I do.
Didn't know the answer to that. What, can you share any insight and say the difference between, say, and again, we're not trying to get down some partisan thing.
Right, I get you.
But can you tell us about how that might be different from, say, writing for Biden?
Yeah, so first of all, I thought you were about to say, just between us off the record, and I was going to point to the cameras that are rolling right now, saying like,
we are off the record. You can say what, feel free to say what you want.
I was born during the day, but I wasn't born yesterday.
Right,
But so one of the things is I inherited the Trump speechwriters' offices, and they clean out everything and send it all to the archives. But like wedged under the desk accidentally were a bunch of their draft speeches.
Oh, really?
And so, so I had these draft speeches, which I then did the right thing and gave them to the archives, but not before reading them. And one of the things I realized very quickly is there are two ways to approach speechwriting. One is you are following your boss's lead, right? The boss tells you what they want, and you're sort of chasing them. The other is you're leading them. You're putting ideas on paper, seeing if they will like it or warm to it. Clearly, the Trump speechwriters were chasing their boss. They were following their boss's lead, because these speeches sounded like a slightly one-click off imitation of what President Trump was saying on the stump. And so I think the greatest disconnect when you watch President Trump, leaving politics out of it, just as an observer of speechwriters, is you could see when he was reading what was on the teleprompter, because he acted as if he was bored with what he was reading, and then he would leave script, and he would start to enjoy his own performance again.
Right.
And so you could see it back and forth.
That's interesting.
And that's one of the things. But he had writers. I just think they spent a lot of time trying to figure their boss out instead of co-create with their boss.
They actually left drafts?
I mean, I think unintentionally they did.
You think? Were they in crayon?
Yeah, come on.
Okay, sorry.
Wow.
Go ahead.
Were there any presidents that surprised you in terms of delivering speeches? I'm sure that you've listened to quite a few, you've seen quite a few, you've read quite a few. Any that really jumped out and surprised you?
I think one of the joys in writing this book was a chance to learn about things I didn't know about, to take a closer look at things that were sort of vaguely remembered. And one of the things that really jumped out to me is that the best, over time, language changes over time, how we speak changes over time, it's become less formal. But you read an FDR fireside chat, and it feels like right now at this moment, that his ability to get into your living room and kind of pierce the truth of your existence feels as relevant today as it did then. Kennedy, similarly, feels as charming today as it did then. So realizing that some of these presidents in the past have been orators. They've given orations. Some have given conversations. They all brought different styles. But the ones who did it the best, it just still holds up. It feels so immediate. And that's what was surprising. I didn't feel like I was reading history. I felt like I was reading commentary on the present.
There was one, I guess, chapter heading Events Intervene. And tell us about September 11th.
Yeah.
Condoleezza Rice. That had, talk about that one, where that was what she, I assume, was prepared to talk about just in general about our foreign policy, and then
exactly.
we know what happened on September 11th.
So on the morning, on the afternoon of September 11th, 2001, Condoleezza Rice was about to give a foreign policy speech at Johns Hopkins. The attacks happen. The speech, of course, gets called off. She was prepared to talk about missile defense. And the speech is still classified, so I don't have the speech in here, but through a Freedom of Information Act request, I was able to get all the materials that she had preparing for the speech. And one of the things that's very striking is that, and part of why I think it remains classified, I'm not trying to score political points in this book, but she was derisive towards terrorism. There's a line in here that basically says, some people think security is more metal detectors at the airports. Like, that would not have gone over very well on September 12th. No. And so the world changed dramatically. The other thing is, it really was going to be a missile defense speech, and it's clear from the materials she had that they were obsessed with refuting the arguments of a certain United States senator who was very anti-missile defense, and that was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden. So it was hilarious for me to go into these documents and see transcripts of Joe Biden on Meet the Press, Joe Biden Senate hearings, and they practiced a type of speechwriting that's called refutation. In other words, you lay out each argument to knock it down. And her speech was basically laying out Joe Biden's arguments and knocking them down.
Wow.
And then, of course, September 11th happens. It's not till many months later that the speech gets rescheduled. Not a word of the original draft remains, except this line that says, the world can change in an instant. And indeed, in that moment, the world really did.
Share with our viewers the story of John Lewis and a tale of two speeches and a tale of two tones.
Exactly right. So John Lewis, over time, I've said, we sand the rough edges off. He becomes almost a fuzzy civil rights character in history. But at the time of the March on Washington, he was a young, fiery, passionate leader of the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he had been in the fight. He had been arrested almost 20 times at that point in his life. He had been on the Freedom Rides. His bus had been firebombed. He wasn't on it at the time. And he talked about the March on Washington and was very clear, I want this to be a march on Washington. I don't want it to be a march in Washington. And he later said, if I was going to talk, and he was invited to talk, and he thought maybe he wouldn't do it, but if I was going to talk, I was going to put some sting into it. And his first draft had some serious sting. He said, we're going to march through Georgia the way Sherman did and burn segregation to the ground nonviolently. President Kennedy, we can't support your civil rights bill. It's too little, it's too late. Patience, he was about to say to those who had been counseling patience, is a dirty and nasty word, which was particularly offensive to the leaders of the Catholic Church. And so everyone begged him to tone it down in service of the larger goal, in service of the larger march. And he refused everybody. Martin Luther King said to him, John, this doesn't sound like you. And he shot back at King, yeah, but it sounds like us. It sounds like us, the young people in the movement. And finally, A. Philip Randolph, the grandfather of this all, the organizer of the whole thing, with tears in his eyes, begged him, said, John, please, we've come this far together. Let us stay together. And Lewis finally relented. And I have a picture of this in the book that I found in the archives of Lewis retreating under the arm of Abraham Lincoln at the back of the Lincoln Memorial, rewriting his speech to make it acceptable to Randolph. And I say that it would have been a different march if people had, if the most memorable speech hadn't been the dream, but had been the nightmare.
The nightmare.
I'm long enough in the tooth to remember Richard Nixon's resignation speech. What might that speech have sounded like if he had, say, refused to resign?
Indeed, he had a draft
That's in the book.
Which he refused to resign.
And
one of the things we forget, you know, I talked about, we remember John Lewis differently. We remember Richard Nixon differently. We forget that he was an incredibly persuasive speaker and had the potential to be tremendously charming. And indeed, once in his career, had saved his political backside by giving a speech that's now known as the checker speech.
Sure.
It's a wonderful speech when you look at it again. Wonderful. And he sort of thought, maybe at this toughest moment in my presidency, I can do something similar.
Right.
I can lay myself bare the way the checker speech laid him bare financially. I can lay myself bare politically. And indeed, that's what the speech says. It says, I've listened to all the tapes. It doesn't look good for me, folks. but here's where, but here's why I think it's important that I stay in office and see this through to the end. And he marshaled the arguments that he had. They were the best arguments he had. They weren't great arguments, but he basically said, we had a president assassinated. We had LBJ basically drummed out of office. Just for continuity's sake, shouldn't I stay around? And this, you know, years later after September 11th, you heard Rudy Giuliani saying the same thing as mayor of New York. Like, just for continuity's sake, you know, shouldn't I stick around? And so he put together the best arguments he could. And ultimately, he determined his position was unsustainable. But that speech also feels very relevant because you start to hear the beginnings of the arguments that leaders make when they don't want to accept outcomes, either by law or the democratic process.
That's great. Sort of like, why not have Dick Nixon to kick around a little longer?
Yeah,
you know?
right.
Just a little
just
longer.
for the sake of continuity.
Just a while, yeah. That's
when
great.
you also look at speeches that were not delivered because of death,
Yeah.
Pius XI, was it Mussolini and Albert Einstein?
So Pius XI, so the last chapter is last words.
Right.
And so in all these other instances, history could go one direction or another. In the last chapter, I take speeches where people didn't know the end was near.
Right.
Or if they did, they didn't know it was so immediate. And so I have Pope Pius XI, Albert Einstein, John F. Kennedy, and FDR. And you mentioned Mussolini because Pope Pius XI was getting ready to disavow Mussolini and fascism. The church, in something called the Lateran Accords, had basically gotten in bed, maybe I should choose a different term, had basically reached an agreement with the fascist government. And it had gone on for 10 years, and Pope Pius was deeply concerned about what he saw happening and basically was prepared to say, this is a mistake. We got to get out of this. This type of leadership, the fascist leadership, is wrong. It is not to be followed. And so when Pius died, everything about that speech was destroyed and like one copy was squirreled away. And so that's very powerful. And then we have FDR. We were still in World War II, but his last speech was to be a big speech where he was looking past the end of World War II. And he had the line, how do we assure not just an end to war, to this war, but an end to the beginnings of all wars? And Einstein, too, it was Israel Independence Day, and he was talking about peace and how to achieve it. And so the theme, coincidentally, that runs through all these last words is, how do we live together as people? How do we live together as humanity? And the last warning came from Kennedy, who, it was a foreign policy speech, and to the extent people remember it, they remember the term, we're the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. But when you read the speech closely, he's also making clear the watchman needs to be looking inside the walls, that there are things that can undermine a democracy from within. And one of those things, and this also felt very relevant to this moment, is misinformation. And so misinformation was very much on his mind at the time of his death.
We don't have a lot of time left, but could you please share with our viewers the anecdote, the story of Barry Jenkins and Moonlight, because that is beautiful.
Yeah, there was a time when we talked about Academy Awards, we didn't talk about the slap. We talked about the fact that they called La La Land for Best Picture when Moonlight had been the winner. And Barry Jenkins was denied the chance to give his Best Picture speech. And he was, and I include this chapter because it talks about the power of story. And he wanted to talk about when he was filming Moonlight in Liberty City, Miami, where he grew up, they had to bring in lights to film at night. And in a lot of these neighborhoods, there aren't lights, but bringing in the lights brought out the children. And at one point as he's filming a scene, he's directing his actors, he looks, and there's a young child, a young black child, who's sitting in his chair in the video village with his headset on. And Jenkins said, that's the moment at which it struck me, that this child was seeing a future for themselves that I didn't allow myself to see. And I love the chapter, and I put it near the end, because it just points to the power of when we see ourselves, when we see our stories told, and when we see ourselves in the stories of others, and why story is so powerful. And that's one of the great lessons in speech writing.
In addition to my idea of a sequel, what's next for you?
So I'm giving myself a little time off. I'm taking the summer off. There may be a sequel coming. There are some speeches coming out of the woodwork as this book is out there, and then we'll see.
Are you optimistic as a former insider? Are you optimistic about the future today? Cautiously optimistic politically?
I am troubled politically. Even when I worked in the Senate, it was easier to find agreement. I so tremendously admire President Biden's willingness, even if it means banging his head against a wall, to try to get to consensus. You know, he's always been about finding common ground. It just feels like common ground is harder to find and a lot less fertile than it had once been. But I do take some optimism in the fact that I've worked with amazing people, incredible colleagues who are there for the right reasons, who are there to help people, Republicans and Democrats. And so if we can have some more of those voices, that fuels a little bit of optimism for me.
Jeffrey Nussbaum, it has been an absolute delight. The name of the book, the title, Undelivered, the Never Heard Speeches That Would Have Rewritten History. Thank you again so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for viewing tonight, Donnybrook and Donnybrook Next Up. On behalf of Ray Hartmann, our entire crew here at 9 PBS, have a wonderful weekend. Good night.
Donnybrook is made possible by the support of the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation and the members of 9 PBS.